So welcome everybody. Let's get started. Please get seated, grab food, get comfortable. Let's have some fun. So my name is Igor. I'm the team lead on the AngularJS project. I come here from the Mountain View. I'm presenting at the conference, and we thought that it would be cool if I could meet everybody here in person. So we made an exception and organized this meetup for Friday, which is not the ideal time, but I'm really surprised how many people showed up, and that's awesome. Thank you very much for coming. This meetup, I have some stuff prepared that I want to show you, but it's really about you asking questions, you finding out something that was unclear, or you didn't know how to solve in Angular. This is the time. Either there are microphones, so this is being recorded. I don't know if this is going to be good video or not, so we'll see. But if there are good questions and good answers, we're going to put it online, and other people can benefit from the conversation we're going to have here. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll give you a mic, and just so you can ask questions. Just show of hands. How many of you know Angular, have been using Angular for some time, and seasoned developers? Okay, about half. How many of you have never heard of AngularJS and you just walked by chance here? One. Welcome. Well, I hope you're at least a developer, JavaScript developer. If not that, then enjoy the food. Okay, so we have about half and half. So I'm going to cover some basic stuff, but again, this is about you asking questions and finding out why things work a certain way in Angular. So I would like this to be really interactive. So please ask questions. So what we're going to do today, we're going to build a very simple application. It's to-do list. I know you've seen this 100 times. The application itself is not interesting. What is interesting is how we're going to build it. And I'm going to try to describe why things work a certain way in Angular. And you can take this knowledge and then reuse them in other situations. So the application is simple, and that's very good because we don't need to deal with the complexity of some business rules or something like that. So the application itself is not working right now because I need a server to be started. So I'm just going to be using a static Python server. So there's no kind of pre-processing going on my computer. I just have HTML files and JavaScript files that are loaded in the browser, and everything that you'll see is happening in the browser. There's nothing happening on the server side. So if I refresh, yes, this works perfectly. Awesome.
So is it fair to say AngularJS is a competitor to jQuery?
The question is if AngularJS is a competitor to jQuery. Can we have the mic somewhere handy? So that, yeah, perfect. So the question is no. jQuery is all about DOM manipulation, and jQuery is all about making APIs, DOM APIs, in all browsers behave in a consistent way, and also making them more developer-friendly. So if you ever worked with the raw DOM APIs, they are not the nicest APIs to work with, unfortunately. And worst of all, they're implemented differently in different browsers. So jQuery solves the problem about how do we expose sane APIs that we can do DOM manipulation with, and how to get these APIs behave in the same way across all the browsers. So Angular is all about how do we build applications in the browser. So it's a high level of abstraction. We are solving problems of how do we do data binding? How do we separate the model from the presentation logic and the business logic? How do we make the application testable? How do we do navigation within the application and that kind of stuff? So it's a higher level of abstraction. And Angular itself can actually use jQuery if it's loaded on the page, but it's an optional dependency. We don't need jQuery to run Angular applications. Can we turn on this just slightly?
Mic is on. So you're coming through that.
Yeah, it's just there's a feedback at least here. I don't know how it's over there.
This mic might be on.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, this is better. Yeah, it's a higher level of thinking, a higher level abstraction, and we are all about how do we build applications as opposed to how do we interact with the DOM APIs in a sane and consistent way.
So to more correctly answer my question, it's more a competitor to Sencha instead of jQuery?
Yes, Sencha is how do we build applications. Sencha is taking a different approach where they provide the full stack and they're saying, you know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is insane. We're just going to provide you APIs to do everything. Whereas Angular's thinking and philosophy is like, HTML is pretty good. JavaScript is also pretty good, but it needs some help. How could we extend HTML? How could we help JavaScript a little bit to make it really powerful and really productive when you're building web applications? But yeah, it's the same space. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Perfect. So let's get going. We have this to-do list. Right now, it's just a static page. When I try to do something, actually, there's nothing, no interaction going on. I can click on buttons, but it's just going to refresh the page. And the reason for this is what I have is just plain static HTML. There's no Angular anything going on. There's no JavaScript going on. I'm just going to walk you quickly through this file. It's just HTML5. This is the index.html. It's a HTML5 file with a header where we're loading some style sheets, AngularJS file, to-do.js file, which is the JS file for our application, and we have body with some heading, paragraph that matches this part, some link, and a very simple list, static list with some static data. And at the bottom we have a form. Nothing fancy, static page. How could we turn this into an application? So first of all, any application in Angular, when you want Angular to bootstrap the application automatically, there are other ways to do it, but the easiest one is just say ng app somewhere within the page. Now, the place where you put ng app is significant because you can put multiple applications on a page, and you can have multiple ng apps on a page, and you can also have a legacy application, and you want just part of the existing round-trip application, let's say, to be a small nested or embedded Angular application. So let's say you have a legacy system with some complicated form, and you would like to use the data binding in the form to be implemented through the AngularJS data binding. So you can just put ng app on that form, and everything else is the legacy application. Just the form is a tiny little Angular application. So okay, now we said that application starts on this body tag, and everything within the body tag is our application. So what I can do now, I can include some very simple data binding. So I can say hello. Actually, if I save the page, we see it here. Let me make it more visible. Okay, perfect. So notice if I remove the ng app, HTML itself doesn't know how to do data binding. So it's just going to render the double curlies, but that's not what we want. We want actually Angular to kick in and teach the browser how to do data binding. So once an ng app is in place, the data binding just works. Now these expressions can be pretty complicated. I can do something like this. So we can concatenate strings. I can run it through a filter, and it's going to be uppercase. In this case, we have different filters. But these expressions can be complicated, but there are some limitations as to what you can do within these expressions, and the reason for that is we don't want you to put too much stuff into the template. We want to guide you to keep the expression simple, but give you flexibility when you need it. But most of the logic should be happening in the JavaScript world, and I'll show you in a bit how that is going to be happening. Okay, so we can bootstrap the application just fine. That's perfect. How would we go about rendering this list of tasks? So let's take this list. Is the font big enough? Can everybody see? Okay, perfect. So let's take this, and I'm going to remove all the other LIs, and this is pretty much the template that we want. We just need this LI to be expanded. What should be the model for this application, and what should be bound to the template in order to expand the list based on a model? To answer that question, we need a controller. So Angular, we say that it's MVC. Some people disagree. I say MV whatever works for you. I don't care, because really you can use it in different styles. So you can make it MVC. You can use it as a MVVM. It's really up to you. So MVW. So in order for a model to live somewhere, we need a controller. To define this controller, we just put here ng controller and app controller. So the name of a controller is app controller. And now this controller should live somewhere. This is just the static LI from this example, so don't get confused. This controller needs to live somewhere. It could live in the global namespace, so if I just define the function called app controller, Angular would find it. That's good for toy applications, but it doesn't really scale well for large applications because you're polluting the global window context, and you don't want to do that. So what we want to do, we want to define a module for our application. And I'm going to call this module to-do-app. Now, this to-do-app module must be defined somewhere. And this is where the to-do.js comes into play. So in to-do.js, we're doing several things. One of them is we're defining the module. So we're going to call angular.module, and we're going to say create a module to-do-app, and we're going to assign it to this temporary variable. And we're going to interact with this module through controller API, and we're going to define what an app controller is, and it's going to be this function. So this is the constructor function for our controller. So perfect. We have a controller defined. We have the controller living in the module. Our application knows what's the name of the module. So now I should be able to get a hold of this module somewhere, and specifically get the model that is defined in our controller, get hold of that model in the template. So in our controller, there are these 4 lines which are defining an array of objects. Nothing too fancy going on. This is just native JavaScript, but this line is interesting. So we're saying scope.items equals items. So we're taking this array and we are assigning it onto the scope object under the items property. Now, what is this $scope? So it's something that comes through the constructor of our controller, and scope is, you can think of it as a context. It's a context that is shared between the controller and the template. And through this context, the controller can expose the model and event handlers that are then available for data binding in the template. So, okay, we should have items model in our context and available in the template. So if I do something like items, it should do something. Oh, look, it does. It's actually going to print the object. So we have the model wired properly, the template sees it, and we can actually do something interesting with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this LI, and I'm going to use repeating construct or looping construct in our templating language called ngRepeater. And I'm going to say repeat over items, repeat over items, and assign every time you get to the next element, assign it temporarily to the item variable, and stamp out a new copy of this element, so of this LI, and data bind it with this item model. Interestingly, now we see that there are 2 tasks, but we still see that it's the content of the task is task1 everywhere. And that's because we didn't data bind to the text. So I can do item.text, and all of a sudden we have 1 plus, 2 plus, and if we check the model, that's what we see here. So, okay, we have 2 items in our list. Let me change this just slightly. But if you look at the model carefully, you see that one of the tasks is done and the other one is not. But both of our checkboxes are unchecked, so they don't really represent the state of the model. And the reason for that is that we forgot to data bind input box, the checkbox, to this model. The way I'm going to do it is through ngModel. And I'm going to say item.done, and that's enough to tell Angular to two-way data bind this checkbox. So whenever I check the checkbox, Angular will automatically update my in-memory model. And whenever the in-memory model is modified, it will automatically update the checkbox state. So if I do something like this, where I done, we see that one of them is false, one of them is true, and when I change this, the textual value actually changes as well. So that's perfect. The data binding is really working for us. So I can now nuke this static list because it's not really helping us much.
Are you hitting refresh, or is it just doing it outside?
No, so I'm actually looking using live reload. It's an extension for Chrome. There is a server watching the file system, and whenever I save, it's going to send a signal to browser to reload the file. So I'm not that fast. I wish I was. But I have tools that make me look cool. So.
Now that you've told us.
Well, no, you can look cool. Just don't tell anybody else. Don't tell anybody else. Okay, so we have this static list. How about this part of the application? We just have some placeholder strings in there, but we really want to show how many items we have in the list. And the way we would do it is, again, using data binding. So we have a model, items, which is an array. And every array has a length property. So I can just directly data bind to it. Perfect. So now we have 2. You understand why this works, right? Perfect. What about this guy? So how many items are remaining? Native array doesn't have any facilities that would tell us, because this is really domain-specific property of a model. So we need to calculate this somehow. And it would be cool if we had a method that we could just call and that would calculate it for us. And it actually works. And the reason why it works is because I already implemented this method. So let's see how this method is implemented. I have the scope remaining. I'm assigning a function to it. So I'm saying there's going to be this function, which when you call is going to calculate how many items are remaining. And there are just 3 lines of code. I'm using the ECMAScript 5 reduce function or method. For those that are not familiar with this, this is just a native method available in modern browsers. And I'm just going over the array, and I'm just checking which items are done and increasing the counter if the item is done. The end result of this is a number of done items. So this works perfectly. How about adding something to our list? So right now, if I try to input something into the input box and I hit enter, nothing happens. So let's implement this functionality of adding stuff.
Check another item, the remaining would be recalculated to
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have showed that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, question?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not sure I understand something, but
sure.
When, for example, when you check that checkbox, how much of the page refreshes? In other words, everything in the NG app refreshes? Is that what you're saying?
No. So there's a difference between what refreshes and what's happening in the model and what's happening in the view. So if your model changes, we will do the minimal amount of DOM manipulation necessary to take the model change and convert it to something that is representative of this model change in the view. So whenever I check that checkbox, the only thing in the entire application that changes is that 2 change into 1. Nothing else changes.
How does it know that that function needs to be invoked?
Very good question. So how do we know what changed, and how do we observe this model mutation changes? The way we do it is we have the lifecycle internally that you don't really see unless you start building larger applications and need to understand better how Angular internally works. There's an internal lifecycle which triggers dirty checking. So dirty checking might sound horrible, but it's actually not that bad, and it turns out that in many cases, it's actually a faster way of detecting changes than any other method available. So what we are doing, we are actually gathering all the expressions that are data bound, and these expressions tell us what are the parts of the model that are interesting to the application. What are the parts of the model that we need to observe? We don't need to, like, if your model is 10 megabytes large array, we don't care. What matters is how much of this model is bound to the view. So what we do is at right time, we will run through all the expressions, calculate the current value, compare it with the last value. If we see a difference, we know that the model changed, and we need to call some.
You would take a hit if the implementation of the remaining method was expensive?
Yes.
You would take a hit?
Yes, I would take a hit, definitely.
Can you manually call the same function to refresh it?
Yes. So the other question is, when do we do this dirty check-in? Because if we do it too often, it's wasteful. If we don't do it often enough, then the model will not be refreshed when it needs to be. So because of the whole event model within the browser, the model can change only when a certain interesting event in the browser happens. And this event can be a click, it can be a key press, it can be XHR coming from the server, it can be a timer firing, any kind of event listener that I mentioned could cause a model change. Now, we want to know about this kind of event, and when it happens at the end of the event, when the event handler finishes running, is when we want to do the dirt checking. Now, how do we intercept all these calls? Like, we could go and monkey patch the native APIs in the browser, but that would not make us very popular in the JavaScript community. So instead, what we are doing, we are offering you APIs that typically wrap all the native APIs in the browser and add this dirt checking at the end of the call. So instead of set timeout, we have a timeout service, which when you call, provides the same facilities and actually extra stuff like promise API and other things. But anyway, if the timeout fires through this defined through this API, at the end of the event handler, we will do the dirt checking. We'll figure out which expressions are dirty, and that will trigger all the action functions which will go and update DOM. And again, they will update only that part of DOM that corresponds to the model, the expression that changed. Does that make sense? Okay, one more question?
Yeah, sorry, going back to that thing, how do you know when, for example, when a function is dirty? How do you know if remaining should be updated or not?
Well, that's simple. You just call it. You get a number 3.
Okay, so you always call it.
Yeah. Okay. So we call it. We get a number 3. We remember that the last time we called it was 3, and next time we do dirt checking, we compare the 3 with the current value, and if it's different, then we know that the model is dirty. Mm-hmm.
For this specific example, you can do it with filters like filter count. Is there advantage to doing it by a function on the scope as opposed to doing it through a filter chain?
Are you talking about Angular filters?
Yes.
There are different ways of doing the same thing. I suppose you could do it through the filter, through the count filter. Yeah, you could do that. It's the same thing. There's no difference. So let's get going. We're going to add the functionality to add new items into the list. And we already have this form here. We just need to data bound it and connect it to the logic that adds the item into the array. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say ng model, and notice every time I use ng dash something, that's an Angular specific API that we use to extend the HTML functionality. These things are called directives, and it's something actually that you can write yourself. All the APIs we needed to implement all these directives are exposed. So we think that Angular core should stay small, but we should give you all the APIs you need to expand on the vocabulary that we provide out of the box. So I'm just going to say ng model, and I'm going to say new item.text. So this is going to be data bound to object with the text property, and ng click add new item. So what I'm doing here is I data bound the input box to this new model, and then I put ng click directive on the button, and when the button is clicked, we're going to call add method and pass in the new item that was created through this input box. Now you might ask, why not use onClick? The reason for that is that onClick first of all, doesn't know anything about the internal state of the application, doesn't trigger the dirt checking that we need it to trigger. But what is more important, onClick always executes in the global window context. So everything you would want to bind to would have to live in the window on the window object, and that it would get super, super messy. So we have this concept of scoping, and that's why the object in the controller is called scope. Which allows you to create these small contexts that contain only information and event handlers necessary for a particular part of the view. And we know how to execute these expressions within this context of the scope. So that's what I'm going to do. And yeah, so this works. The reason why it works is, again, I have the add function implemented here. Oops. What I'm doing is, it's just a very simple function. It takes the new item. It's going to create a new object out of that with the done set to false and the text from the input box. And we're going to push it to our array. So remember, the items is a just plain array that represents our in-memory model. And when we push the item in there, the array will grow. Because the data binding is observing the array, it will notice that we have now 3 items in the array, and it will just stamp out the new clone of the list item, and we'll data bind it to that new item. And at the end here, we're just clearing the text property of that new item, so that when I hit add, the inbox is cleared. So that works quite well. But unfortunately, if I just keep on hitting enter here, I'm adding blank tasks into my list. And that's not really what I want to do. And this would not be the best UI we would provide to our users. So what I want to do is I want to disable this functionality when there's nothing in the input box. And the way I can do that, I can just say, here, ng disabled when new item text is empty. So when new item text is falsy, I want this button to be disabled. So when I go to my application, I actually see that the button is disabled by default. So I cannot do anything. But when I start typing into the input box, all of a sudden I can click the button. And if I delete everything from the input box, it changes. So this is data binding in action. This is what data binding allows you to do very easily. Now think of what would you have to do in order to get this functionality. All the listeners, you would have to register, update the state properly, and make sure that everything just works. That would be a lot of work. But with data binding, it's super simple to do. We had a question?
I was just wondering, disable this it's a property of the button, not a class, right?
So the question was, the disabled is a property of the button and not the class. So what it actually is, button has a disabled attribute. So ng disabled is just a data boundable variant of that. I think I could actually use just disabled in this case if I did it this way. Yeah. No. Disable. Sorry? Oh, right. So you would have to set it to disabled. Okay, let's don't do that. And the other problem with just disabled is that in IE, IE is not very friendly with this attributes that IE will basically just strip the data binding, and it would not work. So that's why we have ng disabled to just work around IE and provide some other additional benefits. The question is, can we check numeric input for currency? Yes. You could turn this input box into a number input box. You can just say type number, and now the HTML5 browsers will give you extra stuff to input numbers. If you enter something else than number, the data binding and validation will kick in and will tell you that this field is invalid, but I don't have CSS for that right now. But you can definitely check and make sure that the user is inputting the right kind of input. Okay, so we have this implemented. That's perfect. How about some form validation? So let's say I want to constrain the user input to 15 characters, because for whatever reason, I don't want the tasks to be longer than 15 characters. What I could do is I could just say max length is 15. And now if I try to enter more than 15 characters, I'm screwed. Like, I cannot do anything more. This works in some applications, but it's often a very bad UI. Like, just think about Twitter, and you're trying to write this really cool tweet, and it's like 142 characters long, and the cutoff is 140, and you just can't express yourself because you can't finish your tweet. It's much better to just let the user enter as much text as he wants or she wants, and just tell the user, hey, you entered too much, go back and edit the input and make it compliant with our requirements. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to change max length to ng max length. And now, if I enter more than 15 characters, the input box turns red. Now, why? How is it possible that it turned red? The reason for that is that by specifying ng max length, I added validation to the input field. And Angular understands that, sorry? Angular understands what max length means. And when it sees the input over 15 characters, it will mark this input box as invalid. And it will mark it through CSS classes. So if we actually look under the hood into the inspector, you'll see that there is a ng invalid class set. ng invalid max length and ng invalid, these are CSS classes. So, and I have just a little bit of CSS in my application. I can show it to you right here, which says if you see an input with a class ng invalid, create a 3-pixel wide border with a red color. And the animation itself, that's just Twitter Bootstrap being awesome and just doing the animation. So actually the whole application is using Twitter Bootstrap so that it doesn't look like crap. Okay, so we have our validation and the input is red. What is missing here? Anybody? Message, yes. Like, we told the user that there is something wrong, but we didn't tell the user what is wrong. And now the user is furious because, like, tell me what's wrong. Okay, so we're going to add a message. We're going to add a simple message. I could do span, and I can just say message or item too long. Okay, I refreshed, and I have the message. Perfect. Except that now it's visible all the time, and that's not what I want. I just want to display it when the form is invalid. So what I want to do is I want to conditional display this message, and to do that I can use a ng-show directive. ng-show directive will show this particular item whenever the expression that I'm adding here evaluates to true. So what I want to show this message when there's a validation error. In order to get hold of this validation error, I need some names. So I need to name my form. I'm just going to call it. I think new item form, and I'm going to add a name to my input box. I'm going to call it new item text, and in my ng-show, I can now say new item form dot new item text dot $error, and if I did everything properly, new form showing list to true, error message too long. No, I did something wrong. Let me look at my notes. Add item.
$error.
Yeah, what do I have? Update this guy here. Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect. So I didn't have the max length. So now, whenever we have a max length validation error, as specified here, we're going to show the message. So this binding will evaluate to true, and we're just going to show this entire span. Perfect. That works really well. We didn't have to do much to get that going. And the last thing in our application is this archive link. So when I click the archive link, I should just go through the entire list and just remove all the items that have been done already. So I can just go to my archive, and I can just say ng-click and call an archive method.
So your form name, that's available in this code?
Yes. So by defining the name, we're just extending the HTML because you can define form names in HTML already. We just whenever we see that there's a named form, we're going to expose all the validation model associated with that form onto the current scope under the name defined in this form.
What if I want to have a custom error that's like, I don't want punctuation in my tasks?
Sure. So you can hook into this whole thing. We provide APIs that allow you to create your own validators. You can actually create your own parsers and formatters. So you can totally hook into the whole two-way data binding machinery. And along the way, you can do validation. But if you want to just do validation, you can just do validation. You would just create a directive, and the directive exposes these APIs that you can call and add your own validation errors. So you can totally do that. Again, this is one of those things where we are trying to just provide something reasonable out of the box, but we are making it open so that you can add your own functionality that is specific to your application, because we don't want the framework to be, super huge. But at the same time, we wanted to do something useful out of the box for most of the common use cases.
So I would look at ng max length and see what it's doing and do something similar.
You can totally do that. You can all the code is open source, so you can just go to GitHub and check it out, see how our validation is implemented, and you can also read docs, and in docs there are some examples of custom validators, so you can do that. So the archive method, again, something that I already implemented, so we are not wasting time here. It's just using the filter method, again, something that is defined in ECMAScript 5. So it's a native method on an array. It's just going to iterate over the whole array, and it's going to create a new array with items that are not done. And then we're just going to override our items model with this new array. So very simple. So this is pretty cool, but unfortunately, when I refresh the page, everything goes away. You can see it here, like my model was reset. The reason for that is there is no persistence going on. I have an in-memory model that was defined in the controller, right here, and that's it. Like we need to do something better than this. And I'm gonna cheadle, and I implemented this already, so I'm just gonna jump to that commit in this application where this is implemented already. Demo. Oops. Okay, perfect. So that worked, and I'm going to walk you through the changes that were done to get this to work. So I have a database in the cloud, MongoLab. Anybody knows about MongoLab? 1, 2, 3, couple of hands. Everybody knows about MongoDB. Okay, MongoDB is one of those NoSQL databases, and MongoLab is a hosted service where you have this database in the cloud and they provide RESTful APIs to interact with the database. So I just have this database in the cloud that I'm going to talk to. I'm going to persist all the data there, and I'm going to fetch data every time my application reloads. So when the application is starting, it's going to make a HTTP GET request to this database. It's going to pull the data in. It's going to show my application, show the data to the user, and then as the user interacts with the application, when I check boxes or when I add a new thing, we're going to persist everything in the database. So if you look at the controller, the first thing you notice that we added a new dependency, item, and you might start to wonder. Where does this item come from, and how does Angular know how to pass this item into the controller constructor? Because obviously item is something application specific, so Angular cannot just know that the second argument in every application is going to be item. This is a dependency injection. Dependency injection is how the entire Angular is internally wired. And we also expose the dependency injection framework to applications because we think that it's really beneficial for applications to be dependency injected, and it helps with structuring of the application. People here, do you guys know about dependency injection and what benefits it provides? Anybody doesn't know? One person? So, okay, we have at least one person here who doesn't know about dependency injection. Dependency injection is about decoupling the whole application into smaller components, and more importantly, taking the dependency resolution between these components out of the application and making it something that is part of a framework. So what that means is that components themselves are not responsible for figuring out how to get hold of the dependencies that they need to get stuff done. It's something that is provided to them by a library or framework. So in simple words, in your application, you are not creating the item instance. For example, it would commonly, like without dependency injection, you would have something like new or get item, and you would have item, and somehow you would provide some dependency because you probably need a JSON parser, you need a HTTP, something that would do HTTP and some other things. So, but then the controller would know how to create this component, which means that not only the controller knows how to do its own stuff, it also knows how to instantiate all these other dependencies that it needs to do. And by knowing all this stuff, it becomes very heavy and also becomes very tightly coupled with all these dependencies. So by taking the dependency resolution out of this controller or out of other parts of the components on the application, these components become reusable, and the application can be rewired without changing anything in the components. Does it make sense? Okay. So item is provided through dependency injection, and so is scope. So you can actually take these two arguments and replace them, and our application is still going to work. It works just fine. How do we do this? Anybody wondering? Because this is like in JavaScript, it looks weird. Like you can just change things and there are no annotations.
I don't understand that. How can you flip the order of the parameters?
How can I flip the order of parameters? The reason why I can't flip the order of parameters is that the order of parameters is not fixed. We're actually at runtime, we're inspecting the signature of this function. We are figuring out what are the dependencies that the function needs, and then we're going to look up instances of scope and item and provide them to this function when it needs to be called. And if necessary, we're going to instantiate these components, because these components are typically lazily instantiated, so the item instance doesn't exist until something in the system actually needs it. Anybody sees a flaw here?
Igor, that doesn't actually work if it's minified, right?
Exactly. This is not going to work when you start minifying your code, because if you run the minifier on this, this is going to be A and this is going to be B or something like that. And then the dependency injection framework will be like, well, I don't know what A is and what B is. So if you are minifying your code, you actually use a slightly different syntax. You would do something like this, scope and item. You provide the annotations as strings, and the minifier will just leave them in. You just close this somewhere here, and everything, well. Oh, I see. Thank you. Okay, so the application still works. So in an application, in a non-toy application, this is the way you would do it, so that it survives the minification. The good thing is that if you're just doing a prototype and you don't care about minification, you can just forgo this. Also, in tests, you can dependency inject your tests, and tests are not minified, so you don't need to add these annotations. We're also thinking about how could we do this without the textual annotations, and we have some ideas how we could extend the closure compiler to actually understand that this is being dependency injected and keep track of the names and just do everything magically for you. Give us a couple of months and hopefully we'll have something like that, which would be really cool. But let's look further down here. So we have this item. So we talked about how do we get hold of this item, and we haven't really talked about what this item is. The item in this case is a RESTful client that allows us to talk to the MongoLab database and persist this item resource, an entity of this resource, as well as query the database for all the items in the database. So this single line here, and let me actually break it up so that it doesn't look like I'm doing too much. This line here will cause a query to be sent to the database in the cloud, and when the response comes back, we're going to assign it to this items object, which is then published on the scope, just like we had before. And the rest of the application stays about the same, except when we are adding at the end of the add event handler, we're going to call save to persist the data in the database. And when we are removing through the archive method, we are also going to remove the individual items from the database. And if we look at the item, so in our Remember To Do app, that's a module for our application. And besides controllers, we can define other types of interesting things that are then available in the dependency injection system. One of them is constant. The identifier of the constant is API key. This is the value. And then we have a factory down here called item. And these are the instructions on how to construct item using a factory function. So the function that we pass is a factory function, which when called will return the instance of the item. And in order to do so, it needs its own dependencies. And one of them is $resource, which is a built-in service in Angular that allows you to generate RESTful clients, and the API key, which is something we defined here. So notice the dependency injection can actually help us break the whole application into these smaller chunks. And the smaller chunks are then easier to test, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. The rest of this, the way how we generate the RESTful client is not that interesting. We're just calling resource. We're passing the database information into it, and this will generate the RESTful client that has query method, save method, and other methods that are necessary for persisting the data and fetching it from the database. But at the end, we are going to return this item, and this is what will be then injected into our controller when we ask for item. So the interesting thing here is this line. What looks weird about it? Remember, this is JavaScript. Carl? No, somebody else. Does this look right to you? Like I'm making a query to the database somewhere in the cloud. This can take 10 seconds or 500 milliseconds. It looks like we are making a blocking call or a synchronous call, but we're actually not. What's happening here, the query method will return immediately. It will fire off the request, it will register its own listener, and will return something that will eventually become the model when the server responds. So what we are getting is this bucket, this placeholder that we can, in the meantime, put on the scope, data bind to it, and just wait for the data to just appear in the bucket. And when the data appears, then the data binding will kick in, and we'll just expand the list, and we'll render it nicely. So this is pretty cool. If you're doing something simple, if you're doing something more complicated and you need to do some calculation or something when the data arrives, you would probably register a callback here, which you can totally do. So you can do like items and just do stuff with items here when the data arrives. So far, so good? Okay, anybody have a question? So just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. So one of the questions I've had as I've been working with Angular is, you seem to be solving 2/3 of the reasons that AMD patterns exist.
Okay.
You know, and I'm wondering if you've done enough that you find in production you can go without something like a require.js. And I know a lot of that is about, you know, sort of lazy loading the things you need, but a lot of the reason I use something like require.js is so I can cleanly define a module and I can cleanly define dependencies, and you've solved 2 of those problems. And so,
so this is a very good question, because people often think that the dependency injection is a replacement for dependency resolution in something like require.js or AMD. And that's not quite true. They are solving different problems. The AMD and require.js, they're solving the problem of how do we figure out that from all these files, from all these JavaScript files that we have, how do we figure out what is the right order in which all these files should be loaded in the browser? And how do we lazily fetch code as it's needed for our application? So this is what AMD and require.js solves, and they do quite a good job of that. Dependency injection is all about how do we instantiate, not load code, instantiate instances of our components from this code that was loaded by require.js. And how do we provide context for all these instances so that we don't have a whole lot of global state. Global state is usually very bad for large applications that need to be well structured, and it's really bad for testing, because if you have testing and you have a lot of global state, that means you need to do a lot of monkey patching, you need to do a lot of cleanup in between tests, whereas if you have something like dependency injection, where there's this dependency injector, which is the context for all the instances for your application, you can just throw away the injector in between tests and recreate the injectors from scratch. And every test can start from a good state, and that means the tests are not going to interfere with each other. So they're solving different problems, and they actually complement each other.
So what you're saying is you still find yourself using some, AMD pattern now?
Most of the applications that we are building, we find that the reduction of code that Angular gives you means that you don't actually need to lazy load code. You just load everything up front. You could definitely, and there are some cases, like Charles could talk about their application, which is very resource sensitive, and they want to load only those bytes that are really necessary. So you can definitely do that if you want to. I'm just saying it's not a common use case for the applications that I'm building. Okay, so we have the persistence working, and as I showed you, if I reload, everything's looking pretty good. Let's look quickly at our testing story. Like, how would we go about testing this stuff? In Angular, we think that in order to build large applications with JavaScript or with Angular or with JavaScript in general, you need a really good testing story, because not only that there are these browser inconsistencies that you need to deal with, but it's a dynamically typed language. It's very easy to make typos. It's very easy to just get something wrong. And somebody would say, oh, that's what compiler will check for you, and you need a compiler to do that. I don't think compiler is the right answer, because compiler will just make sure that the types are aligned and you're calling everything in the right order. But it's not going to check if the application is conforming to the business specification. It's not. Compiler is never going to check that you are actually storing the item when you need to, or that everything is properly data bound or anything like that. So I think that tests a much better validation of the application than a compiler, and you can get all the benefits from dynamically typed language and have an application that can be maintained and scaled if you do testing well. Now, in order to do testing, you need to write a lot of tests. And in order to get somebody to write a lot of tests, it must be super easy. Because if it's difficult, people are not going to do it. So we think a lot about testing and the testability story in Angular, and we are thinking, how could we make it easier? How could we help people structure the application so that it's testable out of the box? And how could we also help with tools that are necessary for testing? And one of these tools that I'm going to show you is Testacular. Testacular is a spectacular test runner, and you can. I think we mentioned it here already, but if you wait, okay, this is the website for Testacular. It's a node-based server implemented with Socket.io, and what it does, when I start it, I just have a shortcut in my IDE that will just fire off a script. And this will start the node server. And I have a browser window down here, which I pointed to localhost 8080 because that's where Testacular started. As of this moment, there is a WebSocket connection created between the browser and the server, and I can forget about this browser window, and I can dispatch tests into this browser. So let's see what my test looks like. So I can go to do spec. These are some of the tests that we wrote for this application. Anybody doesn't know about Jasmine and behavior-driven development? Everybody's familiar, at least somewhat. So Jasmine is just a framework that allows you to write tests. They also provide a runner, which is HTML-based, but there are many issues why you would want to avoid the HTML runner and just use the DSL to describe your tests and do the assertions, and then use Testacular to actually run these tests in one or multiple browsers. Because with Testacular, you can actually capture multiple browsers at once and just dispatch tests there. So what I'm going to do, when the Testacular started, it knows about my source files and the test files, and is watching the file system, waiting for changes to the file system, and whenever any of my files change, it will fire off a new test run and will execute all of the tests. And that's what's happening here. So if I just do something like this, you're going to see down here, this is the output from Testacular, and just says we have a Chrome running, and we executed 7 out of 7 tests, and all of them are passing. So that's pretty good. Let's make a test fail. So let's look at this test. What Jasmine gives you the structure for tests that makes them easier to maintain and read after you write them. So we can say, we have this app controller which has an add method, and we're going to describe this method. And there is a specification for this add method, and the specification says that this method should add a new task to our model. And if you look at the test, we are expecting that our items array is at the beginning empty. And then we call our add controller method that we implemented and passing some fake data. And afterwards, we are assuming that the item's array length is 1 and that the text of the first item is our fake task, the input that we inputted. So this is very nice, easy to read text, easy to read test, and it's a specification for our application. So let's say that I forget to add this task. Now I get a failure. So the stackler is going to complain. It's going to say cannot read property text of undefined. And it's actually going to give me a stack trace, which if I click on, it's going to take me to the line that failed. This is something that WebStorm offers. So if you just have a output in the console that looks like a stack trace, IntelliJ WebStorm is smart enough to parse it and give you this click-through functionality. So we know that this failed, and in order to fix it, I'm just gonna fix this. This is super simple. Now my test is passing. This is awesome. So I'm again running 7 tests. Everything's good. Let's say I do major refactoring, and I have 300 tests, or like in case of Angular, we have close to 1,600 end-to-end unit tests for Angular, and all the DOM manipulation and dependency injection, all the other stuff that we are doing. So when we do major refactoring, it's very easy to get 500 tests failing out of the entire test suite. And you should see the output out of that. Like, it's a huge file with lots of stack traces, and you're like, oh my god, what just happened? Like, how am I going to fix this? So you usually have some clues about where to start fixing. And what we help you with is you can narrow down the tests of interest that should be run. And I can just say, instead of describe, I can do dedescribe. And now only the 2 specifications within this describe here are going to be executed. So that's what I have down here. I fix these tests, or let's say I still have 10 tests failing, and I just really want to focus on fixing just this one. So instead of it, I can do it. And I have this one test now running, and every time I change something in the file, only this single file will be executed. A single test will be executed. So I can really focus on fixing one test at a time and get everything under control. This is really nice. It's not something that Jasmine provides out of the box. It's just something we added on top of Jasmine, but it's available to you if you use Testacular. This is Testacular feature. One thing that is Angular feature that we added on top of Jasmine is this module function and inject function. So I mentioned already that dependency injection is a very important concept in Angular applications, and it's what wires the entire application and takes all the components in your application. Yeah, I'm not taking shuttle home today. It takes all the modules, it takes all the components and wires them properly, instantiates them at the right time. So in order to be able to test the application, you can actually have a full control over the injector, and for each individual spec that executes, we're going to create a new injector, and it's up to you to populate it with the services that you want to test. So in this case, we're just saying that before each of the tests, load the to-do app module with all the services and controllers defined in this module. And we're just throwing some extra stuff here, like we have this mock item, which is a mock implementation of our item RESTful client, so that we don't actually need to make a full XHRs to the server. We can just fake all of the XHRs. And down here, we have this inject method, which allows us to get hold of instances. Again, just like we inject this stuff into the controller, we can inject stuff into tests before each, and it works the same way on it. So I could just wrap this function into inject and get hold of the instances from my injector. So this makes testing really easy, because not only you can get hold of anything within the system, and it's instantiated through the full dependency injection, so all the dependencies will be resolved. But by being able to configure the injector at test time, you can override many of the heavy dependencies that would make testing very difficult. So like with the item RESTful client, instead of making real XHRs, we can actually train it. And I think I have a file here. Yeah. So this is a specification. These are all the tests for the server side, the persistence and all the communication. And what we can do, we can say expect GET request to this URL, and when it comes, respond with this response, where the response is just something that we created for our tests. So we have these fixtures for our tests, and it's very easy to rewire the entire application and to provide this mock implementation of the item rather than to use the real one. So this is end-to-end, this is unit testing, but which allows you to test individual components as well as the interaction between two or more components. In order to test the entire application, which is something you want to do, you want to bootstrap the entire application and pretend to be a user and interact with this application and make sure that the user will actually get the end result, not only that the components are wired properly and each component is doing the right thing, but everything altogether is doing the right thing for the user. You want to write end-to-end tests. This is something that we help you with too, or you can use existing tools like Selenium. So we have our own end-to-end test runner, which I'm not going to go into today, but we can definitely discuss that if you have questions about that. So testing is very important in the whole Angular philosophy, and we put a lot of stress, a lot of effort into making it easy, and we really want you guys to write tests because it's cool. Once you have a good test suite, you are really confident about the code you're writing. Refactoring is much easier. Fixing bugs and regressions are minimized because you just don't introduce the kind of bugs that you would without tests. Any questions about this? One question?
So what's the best way to think about testing? Should you be testing the controller as a unit, controller and view together as a unit?
So the question is, how should we think about testing? Should we be testing the controller as a unit or the controller and the view as a unit? The answer to this is you have these two kinds of tests. And unit tests and integration tests, and then the second category is the end-to-end tests. So if you want to test just the business logic, make sure that your application is actually performing the operations necessary to comply to some business rules, then you want to do that on the unit testing level. The reason why you want to have both is, let's say you introduce a bug in your business logic, and you have only end-to-end tests. What that means is that you're going to have slow tests because end-to-end tests are very expensive to run. And when there is a failure, there is such a huge surface in your application that to narrow it down to a particular line is very time-consuming.
No, but specifically with the
okay.
are you testing controller only?
So I'm actually testing everything. So I showed you just the controller spec, which is this file. I'm going to provide all this code so you can read it. So every method in the controller, as well as the constructor itself, is being tested. But I also have tests for the Mongo app, the persistence, and the item. This is actually the item service that we created. So this is the test of that, and I don't have any other components in this application, but if I had, I would have one file for each of the components that would test that.
All right, so that makes it clear. But so do you write unit tests against the view, or is that not in scope?
That's not. So you don't want to get view involved, and this is actually a very powerful feature of data binding because the controller doesn't know about the view. Like if you look at the controller, there's nothing about DOM manipulation. There's nothing about how do we get hold of the document or do anything with the DOM. You can test the controller without even having any kind of template associated with it. That makes tests very fast and very easy to write, and there is no cleanup to do after your tests are finished. If you are writing directives, which is like the ng repeat and these things that do DOM manipulation, you definitely want to do testing against the DOM. And I could show you some examples. It's not that difficult to do. Actually, I don't have anything set up, so I'm not going to go. But we can talk about that offline if you're interested. It's very easy to just instantiate a little piece of DOM, compile it with our APIs that we use internally to compile the templates, and then just interact with the view kick off digit checking when necessary, change the model, kick it off again, check was that change propagated to the view. That's how all of our domain manipulation is tested. And then the end-to-end tests are for the entire application to figure out. Any other questions about this? Nothing? Okay, so I have just two more things with this application that I want to show you. One is routing. So in small application, it's common that you just have one view, but we're not building small applications, or Angular is not built for small applications. We actually want to be able to have an application that has many views, where these views can be like a login screen, it can be settings page, it can be the main list or the detail list of a particular item, or it can be a form or anything like that. So we need to be able to specify that our application has all these views, and each of these views has some template and likely also a controller associated with this view. And we need to be able to associate this template and the controller with some kind of URL so that we have a bookmarking capabilities and also the back button works. And this is what we commonly refer to as deep linking. So deep linking is when you have more than one view, like I have in this application. I have a very simple menu. One of the views is a to-do list, and the other one is just a hello there example. Notice every time I click on this link, the URL in the browser changes. And if I refresh with the hello there, it's just going to start at the hello view. If I go here and refresh, it's going to start at the things to do view. So this is deep linking in Angular, and the way it's implemented in our application. So I have our to-do app module. And in our module, I'm just going to say, I want to provide some configuration for this module. And in order to do my configuration, I need a route provider. Route provider is a provider that it's an object that allows you to provide configuration for the routing in the application. And what I'm going to say is that when my address bar or the URL in the address bar is / then I want Angular to instantiate the app controller, the controller that we created for our application, and fetch this to-do.html template, which is, I just took everything from the index.html and moved it into this file. But if the URL in the address bar is hello, I just want to load this template and there is no controller. If we have a URL that doesn't match any of these, I want the redirection to the / route to happen. So if I go to something like this, it should just redirect me. So that's perfect. But how does Angular know where to put this contents of this hello template or the to-do template? If we look at the index.html now, what we'll see is that I removed everything from there, and the only thing I kept, I added this menu. The interesting thing is that the way we navigate between the different views is just using links. And this is just another way how Angular really just leverages everything there is in the browser. A browser knows how to handle link navigation, so why should we do something different? And we just add facilities to watch the location service, watch the location state and pull the right thing. But we also have this ngView here, and ngView is just a placeholder in our template that says when a particular route is matched, this is the place in our template, in our index.html, where the contents of our view should be included. So somewhere here will be all the content for the particular view. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I get out of this is this kind of routing. Now you might notice that. Is there a question?
Yes, sir. Can you have multiple views?
The question is, can I have multiple views? You can use ng-include to fetch multiple partials. The routing, the way it's done right now, is constrained to just one ngView. Many people are asking about this facility, so it's something that we'll be adding in the near future. But yeah, there are ways to work around it, but we should do something better because many people have the same need. So yeah. No,
So
that
you
question?
kind of recommend using like a query parameter or something to like deep link to the sub views, because like let's say you've got a logged out view and a logged in view.
Okay.
And then once you're logged in, there are sub views within that logged in view, but you want to be able to deep link to those as well. What would your recommendation be?
So with logging, the authentication is really a state particular to the session, and it's probably not something you want in the URL. It would be something in the cookie or something like that. Carl can talk a little bit about how they deal with that in their application, where they have a third-party single sign-on service which they redirect the user to. The user logs in, comes back, and then depending on the roles that this user has, they load those routes that this user should have access to. But at the same time, they have the same kind of identity checking on the server side. So even if the user was able to bypass the client side, you will always want to have authorization on the server side to protect all the data. So anything you do. Like right, so you could have a route where you have a login page, and that's totally fine, and then just you navigate the right. But the state of the user being logged in or not is independent of what the URL contains. Okay. Can you use the mic, please?
In our case, like we do restrict what routes are available based on the user's permissions. We do that at setup time after we get our response back from the third-party login. But then inside the templates, we use things like ng-show to, if the user doesn't have permission to see something, then we just hide it. And yes, the skilled user could be like, oh, I found it, but it doesn't matter, because if they try to go to our REST API with whatever hidden thing they found, then that's going to protect them because it does all the checks too. So, well, yeah, we restrict the routes. Well, the routes within the UI, because you see these routes here are basically we just make it so they'll see like a 404 on the UI when they try to go to the wrong hashbang URL, rather than them getting like a page that just doesn't work. But at the end of the day, the real security happens on the server side. Everything that's on the client is just a user.
Never trust anything on the client, because it can be faked or tampered with. The last thing about routing here is I'm currently using hashbang URLs, which work really well if you're just doing something simple. If you're building a real application, you probably want to take advantage of the new APIs in the browsers, like the history push state and pop state. These APIs allow you to get rid of the hash from the URL and actually modify the entire URL. In order to use these facilities, you have to opt in Angular. There are APIs, like 2 lines of code that you need to write to get that going. The reason why you need to opt in is that you need to have the server cooperate, and it needs to do some rewriting of URLs on the server side, which is very simple, and you can check the documentation on how to do that. And the best part of this the hashbang versus the push state change is that if you have users that are still on some legacy browsers, IE, then these APIs are not going to be available there. Angular will detect that we're dealing with such a client and will gracefully fall back to the hashbang mode. And it can actually translate between the HTML5 URLs and the hashbang URLs. So if you have users that are just copy-pasting links and sending them through IM or some kind of chat or posting them online, everything will still work. Like Angular can handle the conversion between the 2 URLs once you opt in into the HTML5 mode. So this is routing. And the very last thing I want to show you with this application, notice that when I change the route, there's this very slight delay, and I don't know if you can really see it, but it takes a bit of time for the list, for particularly this part of the view to show up. So we when I switch to the view, I'm going to see this part, and then eventually, a few milliseconds later, this list will show up. This application is too small, so it doesn't really demonstrate the problem well. But if you have a large application, you'll see this flickering. The reason why this flickering is happening is if you look at the controller, what we're actually doing, we are making the query when the controller is instantiated. And the controller is instantiated when the route change happens. So the sequence of events is user clicks on a link, the location is changed, we notice that the location changed, we match it against the route, we see that we need to instantiate this controller and this template, so we start fetching the template and we start instantiating the controller. As we instantiate the controller, we come to this line and we make a query to the backend to fetch the data. This is asynchronous, so we continue. We get an empty model. We have the template, we merge the two, we render the view, but there is nothing in the view, so we have 0 items and 0 done, and the list is empty. And then the server will respond with the data, and this bucket, the items future will be populated with the data. The data binding will kick in and it will render the list. Again, it's really hard to see on this very small example, but if I inserted some delay or something, it would be more obvious. In bigger applications, it's something you would see much more easily. So how to deal with this? And we thought about many ways how we could do this, and there are some tricks you can do. But eventually, we came up with a way I'm going to show you now. Are you familiar with promises and deferreds and queue library and that kind of stuff? Anybody's not familiar with this stuff? So you can think about promises and deferreds as a way to take control over asynchronous callbacks and get them to join callbacks and basically do all these kind of operations that allow you to synchronize asynchronous operations, so that you can say, I have 5 asynchronous operations going on. I don't know when they will finish, but when all of them finish, I want you to do this. And this is some particular task. This is something you can do by hand if you just create counters and do that kind of stuff, but it gets laborious. And promises and deferreds are this concept that allow you to do this kind of synchronization in a very nice way through APIs that are provided. Angular comes with a $Q service, which allow you to create these deferreds and these promises, and then you can take advantage of them inside of the framework. Some of the APIs like $timeout, $HTTP, probably forgetting something else, are using promises. So what you get out of calling these APIs is a promise. And you can use these promises then in your application. The item is using the $resource, which currently doesn't support promises. It's something that we want to implement. And I was just discussing this with Carl. So what I'm going to do here is just, I'm going to create the promise for my item by hand and work around this for now, but eventually we would like the item to just return a promise that you can just use in the system as other asynchronous APIs do. So in my route provider, I have our /route, which will instantiate the app controller and the to-do list, and I have this new property called resolve. And resolve takes an object, and this object has an identifier and a function. And the function is something that is dependency injected, and the return value out of calling this function is a promise. What will happen internally in Angular is when we match this route, we will try to go through this map, and we will collect all these promises. So this is your chance to tell Angular that there are some asynchronous events that needs to happen before we can continue with the route change. So we're just going to pause the route change. We know that the location is about to change because the user clicked on a link. We're going to pause the route change. We're going to fire off all these asynchronous tasks, and we're going to wait for all of them to finish. And when they are finished, we're going to call the controller, and we're going to make the return values, the return values of the asynchronous tasks available to the controller. So in this case, I'm just calling a query. I'm registering a function which will resolve the promise that we are returning out of this with the items that we got from the server. So the end result is when this function is called in Angular, the Angular framework will receive a promise which will be resolved with the items when they come from the server. And if you look at the controller, we now ask for items with a small I in addition to item, because that's necessary for other things. And this items variable will be the array of the actual values. So the end result out of this is, if I'm navigating between the application, again, it's really hard to see with such a small data set.
So would you be staying on the URL there?
Yes.
Or
Yes. Yes. And you can
it takes a long time to actually get all the stuff. You might be stuck there and not necessarily.
Yeah, but we give you option to show something like loading. Like think about how Gmail works. Like Gmail was definitely an inspiration in how to do this, because in Gmail you typically click on something, the URL doesn't change. All this Gmail starts fetching all the data, and only when enough data is available for something valuable, something reasonable to be rendered, Gmail will change the URL and will change the view. In the meantime, you have the loading and you have like a cancel link there. So this is something you can implement with this asynchronous routing.
So the route won't load until all the items in
Exactly.
that resolve object are...
So in this case, this resolve object contains just one dependency, but you can have as many as you want. You can have 10. I'm not saying that having 10 dependencies is a good thing, but you can have multiple of them. And everything will be just synchronized. It's going to wait for all the data to be arrived. It's actually up to you. If you want to just, let's say you have 5 dependencies that you need to fetch from the server, but only 3 are critical to show something reasonable to the user, you can say, you can define in this resolve parameter, you can define 3 of them and fetch the 2 lazily from the controller when the controller is instantiated. So that's an option. So this is something that was added to Angular just recently, and that's why I'm showing it to you, because probably nobody here knows about it. Carl?
I mean, I know of it. But two minor questions. As far as the ones that don't block it, that you say load lazily in the controller, would it be a simple extension to this to mark things as like not part of the promise that you begin fetching here, but they aren't necessarily fetched when the controller is loaded? It's like you have 3 things that need to be resolved and a 4th thing that you can fire off at the same time. But
so you're saying that can I start fetching stuff but not block on it?
Yeah.
It should be possible. If what you return is not a promise, then we're going to think that it's a constant, in which case it's already resolved. So you could.
So yeah, you could return one of those like stub like empty arrays that's going to be popular. All right, that's cool.
Yeah.
Second thing is the implementation question. Does it compile that template before it's resolved, or does it wait until that's done?
So it actually starts fetching the template as soon as it's so. Internally, what happens is that we see that you are asking for template, and we also see that you're asking for all these async dependencies. So we are actually going to take the template and we're going to make it one of the dependencies in addition to what you're asking for, and we're going to fire a request for all of them. If we have the template in the cache, we will just take it from the cache and it's going to be super quick. If it needs to come from the server, we have to wait for the template to come from the server. We'll put it to the cache and continue.
I mean, I assume it waits to link it until you have everything, but does it even compile it down, or does it?
It's gonna wait. It's just gonna fetch the template. It's not gonna start with compilation until all the data is available.
Okay. I'm going to suggest you.
Okay, maybe. Pull request welcome. So this is about all I had. I showed you many things. I showed you data binding. I showed you form validation. I showed you dependency injection. I showed you routing, talking to the server, testing. I covered many things. I showed you some tools like Testacular, Jasmine. One thing I should have mentioned and I didn't is actually I don't know why I don't have it in this file. I highly recommend that you use strict mode. So this is ECMAScript 5 feature, which will which will turn the JavaScript engine into more strict environment, and it's not backwards compatible. So there are some things that were removed from the JavaScript language, which are considered to be not good. Either they present a security issue or maintenance issue. So there are some things that were removed, but there is an extra error checking that is enabled if the JavaScript is running in this mode. So you get to know about accidental leaks of variables into the global window, typos and in your variable names or function names and that kind of thing. So I highly recommend using ustrict. You need to put it into either the global closure of your application. So it can be scoped either per file or per any of the functions. So I could just actually take it and I can put it to this function, and now only this part of the my application is going to run in the strict mode. But what we typically do, we just put it on top of each file so that it's available when we are testing, when we are running tests. And when we are deploying to production, we concatenate all the files. We remove all the usestrict strings, and we just put one at the very top of the application. Excuse me?
Does it matter if you keep them in there?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The only requirement is that the usestrict statement is the first statement in your function. That if it's like a second, then it's going to be ignored. If it's a first statement, then that will trigger the strict mode. So I highly recommend that. Sorry? So the question is there a big time penalty? There is no time penalty that I know of. This is the default for Angular, and Angular is definitely not slow.
Two quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
When does compilation happen? Is this not interpreted?
Right. So the question is, when does compilation happen? Compilation, it's an overloaded term. In Angular, it's the compilation of the template. The compilation happens on the client side in the browser when the application is being bootstrapped. So the sequence of events is we load the HTML in the browser. The HTML will pull JavaScript files, CSS files, and all that stuff. And eventually it will fire DOM content loaded. If you have the ng app attribute anywhere in the DOM tree, we'll find it and we'll know that now is the time to bootstrap the application. And if you provide the module name, then we know that this is the module definition for the application. And Angular will take this module, will create a new injector. We'll configure the injector with this module. If you don't have a module, then just assume that there are no custom services, and just going to default to those services that are provided with Angular. And once the injector is created, we will take the root element, the element on which the ng app attribute is defined, and we're going to compile it with our compile service. So that's something that injector knows how to create and how to instantiate. And we just pass in the root of the application. It will trigger the compilation. The compilation is really us traversing the DOM tree and looking for these interesting directives. Directives is like a piece of JavaScript code that tells the compiler that when you come across ng repeat or when you come across ng show, there is this JavaScript definition of a component that needs to be associated with this DOM, and this component. This JavaScript then typically registers event listeners or does some DOM manipulation or does the data binding and all that kind of stuff. So as the application is starting, we will compile the entire template. We will come across ng controller, for example, which will cause the instantiation of the controller, which might fire off XHRs and all that stuff, populate the model, and as we go further down, we see all these data bindings, and if we see the model to be present, we update the DOM. If not, we just wait for the model to change, and when the model changes, we update the DOM then. Does that answer the question?
Wow.
There is a lot of stuff going on when the Angular application bootstraps. Is actually quite impressive when you just take the debugger and just go through the whole thing, because there's just like so much covered under the hood, and it actually makes sense. Like the dependency injection really cleaned up many of the things that happen in Angular internally, and also helps your application when it starts.
The other question I had is, I'm on the Dart mailing list, and there's been a lot of activity there, and obviously that's a very different approach from this. And I don't know if the boss is here, and I don't want to get you into trouble or anything, but I just wanted you to comment on this approach versus, say, Dart.
They're just two different. Like, I don't think that they really. It's not like it's a competition or anything like that. They're trying to solve a problem of. We think that JavaScript is a wrong language for building large applications, whereas, and they want to solve the problem by creating a new language that is optionally statically typed and has all these facilities that would allow you to do compile time checking, all that kind of stuff. So they think that that's the answer to creating large maintainable applications. We, on the other hand, think that JavaScript is actually a pretty neat language. It's the DOM manipulation and handling all these events and just generally just the interaction with the DOM that really sucks. And that's the problem that we are solving. So yeah, you could see that there is some overlap, but we are really trying to take the existing browser and make it just work better for building web applications, whereas the Dart team is building a new language that can solve some of the problems that Angular can solve, or they because of the nature of the language and the VM that they're going to provide, they can be able to solve problems that are currently out of scope of web applications on the client side. So many people ask if Angular is ever going to be written in Dart. My question is, I don't know. Right now we're focusing on the JavaScript implementation, and Dart is missing some of the facilities like reflection and some other things. Many of the things in Angular are done at the runtime, and we need to really introspect. There's a lot of introspection of code happening at runtime, and Dart just doesn't have these facilities right now, so I don't think it will be feasible with the current version of Dart to implement anything like Angular. I think there was a question in the back.
I was kind of wondering how you do this problem. Going back to what you said about JavaScript not being suitable for application development. I mean, some of the things you said, your whole talk almost seems to contradict that. But going back to something more specific, suppose I wanted to have an NG app that gets started and stopped. In other words, I want to have a span that somehow gets loaded with a certain NG app, and sometimes later gets unloaded, or another NG app gets started. Is that at all possible?
Right now, we don't have a concept of destruction of an application.
Okay.
I think if you tried, you could do it, but it's just not something we commonly see. Like typically, when a page is loaded, the application just lives until the page is reloaded. Why would you need this?
Well, what I would want is a page that can start many applications, that can have a button that says Start App A and then Start App B and stuff like that.
There's actually somebody who's creating this kind of like meta application where they want to be able to do something very similar, and I believe they have some ways to do just this. Okay. I don't know. Probably if you search on mailing list, you could see a discussion about this. It's just not the primary use case, but if you file a bug and say, this is what I want to do, this is the current state, and this is what I would like to get, we can just implement it.
Okay.
It's not unreasonable.
I would say also, you could, if you, instead of thinking of it in terms of NG app, if you wanted to have each of your little things be you can write, when you write a directive, it can have a controller, So if really all you're concerned about is having a bunch of different controllers that appear and disappear, you can do that if you load them as directives rather than as ng apps.
I've heard this secondhand, but how did Angular come to become a Google-sponsored project?
So there's this crazy guy at Google on my team called Mishko Haveri, and he was in his free time hacking on this cloud-based service for web designers that would allow web designers, not developers, web designers to build applications with nothing but HTML and an extension of HTML. Well, it turns out that it's kind of really difficult to explain all these application concepts to people who just know really how to use Photoshop and Illustrator really well, but they don't really understand the workflow and the application flow that is necessary to build an application. So it wasn't a total failure, but it just wasn't the right thing at the right time. But we looked at this, and there was some other project going on Google. And that was actually a GWT project. And Mishka was working on it and some other people. And they were really frustrated with the testability story of GWT because it's just not very good. And the team was very test-driven, and they really wanted to have a good test coverage for the entire application. But they just felt like they had all these hands tied, both hands tied behind their back, and they couldn't just do what they wanted to do. Eventually this became a problem, and they couldn't just maintain the application the way they wanted, and there was just a lot of frustration going on. So Mishka, being Mishka, he was like, well, I can just rewrite this entire application that we've been working on for 6 months, and I'm just going to rewrite it in Angular in 2 weeks. And we were a really cool boss, and boss said, I dare you, do it. So Mishka went off, and he started rewriting the entire application that this team, I think of like 3 developers, was working on for 6 months. And it took him, I think, 2.5 or 3 weeks to rewrite it in Angular. And then, so he lost the bet, but he did finish the rewrite. And then after 3 weeks, everybody looked at the application like, well, this actually makes sense. Like, we're using HTML to define our views. We are taking very little JavaScript and using that to describe the business logic in our application. And the application is much smaller. It was like, I think, 17 times smaller when it comes to number of lines in the code base. And it's easier to maintain. The tests are easier to write. You don't need to recompile everything and wait 5 minutes to see any kind of CSS or silly HTML change in the application, because with the Angular applications, as you see, you save it and the browser refreshes, you see it right away. So everybody was like, well, there's probably something into this. Like, it's not ideal. Like, this was like 2.5 years ago. It's not ideal. It's not a general purpose framework because Angular was not designed for this kind of thing. But long story short, I joined the team, and we took Angular, what it was back then, and made it a general purpose framework with still the simplicity that was targeting the web designers, but with facilities necessary for web developers to actually build real applications with it. So that's how it was. Another question?
Yes. Question is, how do you integrate with third-party libraries, jQuery, how do you easily integrate with such libraries? I mean, everything is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's very simple. It's very refreshing. Then you want to put back a data picker from jQuery UI.
So the question is, how do we do integration with third-party libraries, and what is the integration story? Are we a good citizen or not? So we try very hard to be a good citizen in the whole ecosystem. I already mentioned this earlier. If jQuery is available, we can actually use it internally and do all of our DOM manipulation with jQuery, so you get some of the performance benefits that jQuery has. If you're building a smaller application, you probably don't want to incur the 40K penalty of downloading jQuery for just something simple. So you don't, for simple applications, you typically don't need jQuery at all. We also don't change anything in the browser, so we don't change any of the prototypes or mock, or just we don't mess with anything. And we also stay just within the ng app container that you defined, so you can integrate your other application parts can live outside of it. We also providing you an APIs that allow you to create this widgets or integrate with existing widgets like jQuery UI. So if you want to use a date picker integration, you can definitely do that. Depending on the complexity of the component you're trying to integrate with, sometimes it's very trivial, sometimes it's more complicated. It depends on this particular component. So like the date picker, we have an integration for that. Keep in mind that many of these components were designed without data binding in mind. So you need to create a lot of glue, or it depends.
Essentially, I mean, date picker, jQuery is just an example, but essentially things that actually start manipulating the DOM.
Yeah.
Adding elements.
Yeah. So you just say, you can just say, this div or this part of the DOM is designated for this third-party widget, and you need to write the glue that will do the data binding between your model and this widget.
But how do you do it? Do you write directives?
Yeah, you write directives. Yes, yes. You write directives, or you reuse existing directives. So there are people who already wrote these directives, and you can just get them and reuse them.
Okay, my turn.
Sure.
What would be some other ways to do the persistence? So instead of using a Mongo app.
Yeah, so there are infinite number of other options. You can use local storage, which is very trivial. You can use JSON-P. You can do cross-domain requests to your own storage. You could use cookies, but it's not the best thing to do. But you could store some limited amount of data in cookies. You can probably do something with DOM, but that would go away with refresh. And many options. And do you have anything particular in mind? Like, you could use WebSockets if you wanted to. Like, pretty much anything is possible.
Thinking it doesn't necessarily has to be a question specific to AngularJS, but say you have how would you, if say you have your own backend in Python, how would you send the data back there?
So just expose the backend through HTTP interface, and using the XML HTTP request, you can make HTTP requests to the backend. So you can either just have your own kind of API, or you can just follow the REST guidelines and create the REST backend. I showed you how to generate RESTful clients, but we also have the lower level HTTP service, which just allows you to make any kind of custom HTTP query, get, post, whatever you have.
Thank you.
All right. I had a quick question on specifically the router and the controller priority. We're working on one of those apps that you can see when you change the router that it does stop and then it loads, like it's a slower load. But something else I noticed is the controller. If we try to set the controller with the template of, let's say module 1 is where the router is, module 2 has a controller that we want to set the module 1's template to. So when we do that, if we use it with the template URL, it doesn't work. But if we put the controller, that same controller from module 2, as in the partial, then it works. So is there like a priority, or are we going about it wrong?
I'm not sure I understand the problem. Sorry. Can you just go over it one more time?
No problem. So whenever we have the template URL and we also have the controller set in the route. If we have two modules, module 1 has its own controllers, module 2 has its own controllers, but module 2 is injected into module 1.
Is injected, so the module 1 depends on module 2?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the controller is in module 2, but if we call the controller from module 2, it doesn't work in the router. But if we just have the partial and we say, we have the top div to the controller to module 2, then it works fine.
I don't know why that would be the case. If you can reproduce it, we can either show me your application or just reproduce it on a small application. We could just look into it.
Okay.
It sounds like I'm not sure, because this is dependency injection. There are no scopes in the dependency injection. So
It's scoped to the module.
No, all the modules are loaded into just one big bucket. So within the injector, all the services will just end up in one namespace once all the modules are loaded. Yeah, just having an example would definitely help, but it should work.
All right, thank you.
So I have some, definitely ask more questions. I have some stickers, AngularJS stickers, if anybody's interested for a laptop or your way. So just come here and get some. But yeah, feel free to ask more questions and we can just continue with this.
Can you talk some about the roadmap?
The roadmap. So we hit 1.0 about a month ago or 3 weeks ago. I don't know. It was a blur. We want by the end of the summer, we would like to have 1.2 done. So we're going with the unstable, even, odd, unstable, even stable. So we're starting to work on the 1.1, which is down stable. And we would like to be done with that by the end of the summer. What it will contain is better support for animations. So right now you can do some animations, but not all of them, especially when for like route changes. We would like to have better support for that. So that's one of the things we want to add. We want to give you better error messages. So right now we try to be pretty good with whenever there's an error and give you as much information as necessary for debugging. But the more error messages we have in the framework, the bigger the minified file is. So for this reason, like we cannot put too much textual information in there. I actually came up with this way to solve this problem. That is, in the minified file, we have the full error messages. And during the minification process, we're actually going to remove the strings from error messages and replace them with error codes. So in production, you'll see error 25, and then you can go and look up what error 25 is. But during development, you'll see error 25. You did something wrong. So during development, you'll see that's one of the things that is almost done. We're just finishing that. There are some other things like ng blur and ng focus, commonly needed event handlers that we don't provide out of the box. We want to add those, and a whole bunch of bug fixes. I think that's about it. So this should be done by the end of the summer. There are many other things like better routing, having like multiple views, support for multiple views, better support for resources. Again, something that we want to tackle this year. Advanced compilation. So many people are asking for being able to use the advanced mode in the Clojure compiler to minify the code. Currently, this is not possible because of the expressions in the template referring to the named functions and object properties in the JavaScript code. So you can use only the basic optimization, which is still pretty good. Like you get pretty good compression ratio, but you would get even better compression ratio if the advanced optimization was turned on. So that's one of the things that we want to tackle later this year. We're also starting to think about server-side pre-rendering for better CEO and performance. That's a big task. It's going to take several months to get that done, but we're definitely interested in solving that problem.
So you think this year?
Excuse me?
This year?
Possibly. I don't know if it's going to be part of the 1.0 or if it's going to be like 2.0, but we definitely already started working on this year. I just don't know if it's going to be finished this year. We're going to have some version of it this year. I'm not sure if it's going to be like production ready, but internally in Google there is a lot of interest in this, so we'll have at least a version for us to play with internally at Google and see how well it works and if it's ready for prime time. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions? Right here.
Question. So, like somebody said, the only way to build a large complex application is not to build a large complex application.
Exactly.
Right? So if we want to write an application that has, let's say, 2 or 3 modules, how do they communicate with one another, considering they're completely decoupled from one another?
So there are several ways how modules can interact. One of them is through dependency injection, so you can say that this module depends on some other module, and then the services from the second module are available to the first module, so you can just dependency inject it. The other one is through events. Within Angular and within the scope contexts, we have a concept of firing events and listening on these events. So you can communicate between these components through events, and that's completely decoupled. Then you could have two modules that don't know about each other at all, but can still interact.
So there's some kind of a centralized event dispatcher that gets this.
Yeah, it's done through the scopes. The reason why, yeah. So scopes have $on, $emit, and $broadcast APIs, and through these you can fire events and listen on events. The reason why it's part of the scope is so that it's garbage collection. When you have this evented system, you always need to be able to deregister listeners and not to forget to deregister listeners when components go away, which is a very tricky thing to do right. The scopes already serve as a garbage collection barrier in the application, and we just create them and destroy them at the right time, which frees up memory and unregisters all these binding listeners that we use internally. So we use the same facilities to do this event listening and broadcasting, and you benefit from not having to register listeners because we do that for you.
So where would you write the callbacks for these?
That will be a part of the scope. So in your controllers, you could just listen on events, and when the write event happens, you'll hear about it.
What's the best practice? I mean, a lot of frameworks essentially have some kind of a major parent view or some element that comprises other modules and elements, and it kind of oversees the events. So it contains it umbrellas the entire thing, but it's a form of coupling.
Right. Yes.
So.
Yeah. So I don't like to see many people when they start building Angular applications, they realize that we have these scopes that are nested, and the child scopes see everything that the parent scope contains and sees. So they often see like, oh, I need this model everywhere, so I'm just going to put it on the very top scope, and then it's going to be available everywhere. What that creates is this hidden dependency that is hard to maintain and hard to test. So it's much better to use the dependency injection in this case, and just have the dependencies explicitly injected into components that actually need it. So dependency injection is usually the right answer in these cases.
And it actually serves two cases. The module dependency is also a dependency injection, and declaring it on scope is another form of it, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I just have a suggestion. When I was first learning the product, the examples, at least the ones I saw, came back. The JSON came back as an array rather than an object, and there was one switch that said array true false. But it took me a while to get the object to display properly. So. Am I clear? So, because most of the samples just come back as array, it's very simple and just shows in the grid. All my REST services come back as an object with maybe embedded arrays.
Okay.
And I didn't see any examples of that, and maybe it's just in the beginning.
So in that case, let me just jump. Was it? Memory. So let's say we have this state of the application, and you're saying that your model is actually something like
results,
tasks, and task is the array, right? So in this case, what you do is in your repeater, instead of binding to items, you would have tasks.
Yeah, I eventually figured that out.
Items.tasks.
And my point was, I did figure that out. It just took me quite a while. And what happens when you have, if you take Mongo and you have a lot of it, you can have a lot of embedded arrays. So for me, it would be great to see an example of how you display those embedded arrays.
Okay.
Just a suggestion.
Send a pull request. We'll include it. It's really difficult to create examples that will show everything, but
No, I
Yeah, if you feel like that's something that we should definitely have, then just send us a pull request.
Okay.
Oh, over here.
Last question. So when you start building an app, when you start building an app, where do you begin? You normally start with the routes, and then you work your way down from there with the model.
It depends on whom you ask. Typically, I like to build my applications. It's just like I showed you. Like I have some static HTML, so I have a basic idea of what I'm trying to build, what the user interface is going to look like, and I just bring it to life. There are other people who just approach it from the model, so they're thinking about models and what the data looks like, what the data structure is like, and they start with the server-side communication and all that stuff, and then come to the model and create some UI. So it's really up to you and how you approach development in general, but you can use different ways of doing it. Over here?
I'm just curious, if you want to keep your HTML as pure as possible, you don't want to use directives, how would you go about doing it from within JavaScript? Is there a way to do it?
So I should have mentioned.
So some designers may not,
right.
They may not like to work with
Yeah.
directives and stuff.
So I should have mentioned that the templates written in this way are invalid by default. It's just we think that for small applications, like having the short syntax is better. If you're building a large project, like Carl is working on, then they definitely want to be able to validate the templates against the HTML validator. So you just prefix the ng repeater, all the any kind of directive in Angular with just data dash, and it's going to work, and you can then pass the validation. If you're building XHTML, you can use the XML namespaces, so you can define ng namespace and just put ng colon repeat instead of ng dash repeat, and everything will still work. Like we support multiple ways of consuming these directives. When it comes to the designer and the designer not liking all this stuff in his template, the main idea of Angular, and the reason why Angular is called Angular, is angle brackets. Like we're trying to extend HTML to make it suitable for applications. You could bypass Angular and just do everything from JavaScript, but it would be likely very painful, and you would end up writing, the typical jQuery-like code with lots of boilerplate. So while it's possible, we think this is definitely much better. And yeah, just explain to them that. There are many benefits, and I've seen many times that developers, that designers, once they've seen how Angular works, they actually like it because they can create mocks. They can like I did. The application didn't talk to the server until like 7th step or so. So they can create mocks that are actually interactive. They have some kind of limited business logic in it. And they can do it without the server, without any kind of database or anything like that. So what we see is that these designers often become very light developers of applications. So,
how do you guys check? How do you guys test deferreds? Do you use like spies and things like that?
Deferreds?
Yeah.
So with promises, one of the main guarantees that the promise API gives you is that all of the interactions with the promise object are asynchronous, which means that all your tests should be asynchronous. But because of us making sure that all the testing is easy, there are ways how you can flush all the asynchronous tasks. So you can actually write the test in a synchronous fashion. You can just say, do something that will trigger a promise to be generated, get hold of the promise, and now flush the promise. So flush all the asynchronous tasks in the system synchronously, and check if the promise was resolved to the given value. So there are APIs to do that. And you can definitely look at the tests inside of Angular, because we have like lots of tests for all the promises, so you can see how it's done.
Okay. Inside of in one of your examples, you had created a service using factory. Now, does it matter whether you use factory or that service to create it?
So it's a good question. Let's see. So I'm just going to create something. Let's say I want service foo, and I'm going to take the scope and I'm going to expose it on the scope. And in my template, I'm going to take the foo and I'm going to say foo to-do list. So foo is going to represent the username in this case. Now if I refresh it, it should probably throw error. If I can get to console, yeah. Yes, so we have an error saying that we don't know what foo is and there's no provider defined for foo, so you are doing something wrong. So I need to define the provider for this service, so I can do the simple thing. I can say foo is a value, and foo value is Igor. Now if I go here, foo value, foo, okay, reduce. Foo value. Let's see how debugging in Angular works. So let's figure this out. So another nice thing about Angular is that you can use the native debugging facilities of the browser because you're just dealing with JavaScript and HTML. And you can use the web inspector to observe the DOM, and you can use the debugger to figure out what's going on. So in this case, we have an exception that says that reduce is undefined on a method in the remaining. So
Is that because you added the tasks for
yes, thank you. That's fine. So, but just to complete this, so we know the error comes from the remaining function, so we can actually put a breakpoint in the remaining. And if I reload the page, it's actually going to break here. And now if I observe the item, I'll see that it's an object and we expect it to be. So usually tests would capture this and you would see a test failure sooner than this. But if tests are not telling you why this is not working, then you can definitely go to the debugger. Okay. This is remove. This is still failing. Why is it failing? Okay, it works now. So, okay, so we are good to go. So now, because of the binding foo's to-do list and foo is an Igor provided here, everything just works. So we define this the foo is a value, and then the Igor string is provided to this controller, and then it's bound. Now, let's say that that foo is not a constant. It's something that we need to calculate. So the way you would do that is through, for example, factory. And factory is a function that will be called. And this is silly, but just think that we do some operation to figure out what foo is. And when this controller asks for foo, there is no foo instantiated yet. But we know how to instantiate it because this factor is the definition of how foo should be constructed. And we go here, execute this function. This function can have its own dependencies, so it can ask for I don't know, HTTP service and make an XHR request, or it can do other things. And eventually it will return some object, and this object will be then used for the injection. So service is another way of doing this. In this particular case, service doesn't make a lot of sense, but service takes a constructor function. So we're actually going to call new. You can think of like us calling new on this function, and you can dependency inject it, of course, if you need to. And whatever the constructor returns, so you typically don't have a return. You just do something like this: name equals foo, and you do your constructor stuff. And the instance returned from this constructor is what we inject in this controller. And there's I think provider, which is a variation of this, and I think that's about it. Does that answer the question? Yes. Okay. So it's just different ways of defining how the value that should be injected later on should be constructed. Another question?
It's probably a mistake. No, sorry.
So it's probably a mistake on my side, but maybe you have an easy answer for me. But basically, so I have a sample application, a couple of templates. In one of them, I have a script tag. And in the script tag, I put a console log. And I don't see the output of that console log in
so you
the
don't
console
see it,
window.
Right. You don't.
Just wondering why.
You don't see it because you're not using jQuery in your application. If you are not using jQuery in your application and you include a template, what happens is that we do inner HTML, and actually jQuery does inner HTML as well. And inner HTML by default will ignore all of the script tags, so it will the script tags will remain in the DOM, but they will be not executed. So by default, this is how DOM APIs work. jQuery goes out of its way to just search for the script tags and execute them for you. So they're actually doing extra stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, that's why it doesn't work.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I used the plugin for WebStorm and some watch values, and that really helped a great deal when I was debugging.
Yeah, so the other thing you can do with WebStorm, you can connect to the browser that is running, and you can put the Chrome into a debug mode, and there is a remote API that the WebStorm can communicate with the browser, and you can have the application running in the browser, but see the stack trace and all your watches within the WebStorm. You can step through, and you can use the WebStorm facilities. The same thing is possible with Testacular, so you can configure Testacular to run in this mode where you can step through your tests and observe the values. That's possible too.
I'm very interested in web components and how that is. Is there an Angular roadmap? I've tried to experiment with directives, injecting directives via CSS selectors and stuff. And so the problem I ran into is a lot of pieces interact poor, filter and repeat and other things interact poorly with. But I assume that's a bug. But what are your plans for web components specifically? And
so web component specification is for those of you that don't know, it's a specification for, I think it's part of the HTML5 umbrella, I believe, and it allows native facilities for the browser to be able to create custom DOM elements. So, I had an ngView earlier, that's something the browser doesn't understand what it is, and it will keep it in the DOM, but it will not render it or will not do anything with it. And just through Angular magic, we know how to get browser to understand what this is and how to render it properly. But there is this web component specification which aims to make it possible to create these custom components, these custom elements, and more importantly, make it possible to create components that are completely encapsulated and reusable. So you can think of this component as a mixture of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is completely isolated from the environment in which it's being used. This way you can create a date picker without worrying about some kind of CSS interfering, CSS on the page interfering with your component. In many ways, the directive API is very similar to the web components. The web components is more declarative and it's using more of the DOM, the HTML APIs and the declarative parts of HTML, whereas the directives are very, partly HTML, but there's a lot of JavaScript going on. But we talked to the team that is working on the web components, and some of the parts of Angular were inspired by web components, and some of the parts in web components were inspired by Angular. So there is a lot of exchange of ideas going on. For a while, we thought about Angular being a shim for web components, so you can actually create web components in existing browsers with the magic of Angular. But there are so many powerful features that web components add, like the template tag and this encapsulation, that is just not possible to shim. So while Angular can help you create components that feel and require you to think in the same terms, it's impossible to create a complete polyfill for the web components API. Right. You cannot scope styles. You cannot do the kind of isolation stuff. So we're in touch with the team. We are thinking about how could we bring directives even closer to web components, and this is something that we are still working on. But our roadmap is to pick up the pieces that web components offer and start using them internally in Angular as soon as they are available, and just expose them to applications so that they can benefit from it. So like the template tag is a good example. Template tag is just something that would allow you to embed a piece of template that should not be visually present in the page and should not run any of the script tags. So it's like an inert piece of DOM that is in the DOM just for the purposes of further templating. So the templating engine or JavaScript code can get hold of this template and do something interesting with it. But it should not be visible to the user. It should not affect the runtime of the application. So components like this is something that we want to use internally. Other questions? So I'm going to go grab some of the more food that we have. Thank you. I have a few more stickers. If anybody doesn't have one, just hang around for a little bit. Come to me if you have any questions that you want to discuss. And I hope to see you again in a month or so. We try to do this once a month, and we either have local speakers or we do some presentation from Mountain View over the VC. But we want this to become like a monthly meeting where people come and discuss their problems or share ideas. It's important for us to get feedback from people who develop with Angular so we know how to improve the framework further. And it's also important for you guys to get to know each other. And we see lots of people interested in hiring people with Angular skills. And this is a good place to meet these people or get contacts and stuff like that. So thanks for coming.
And if you want to demo anything,
yeah,
you could email.
If you have an application that you're working on and you would like to demo it and share some experiences and some stories from the development of the application, then just let us know and we'll give you some space.